Hello and welcome to Straight On to Disney, a Disney deep dive and analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, takes a deep dive into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at Straight On to Disney Pod. I also like to quickly thank Walt Disney World News Today for being able to circulate all the news that I discuss in a moment. I also like to thank Disney.fandom.com for where I get most of the production history and the general notes for this podcast. And I also like to let you know that you can catch me on the Disney Hot Topic channel, potentially weekly, seeing how the schedule's online, chatting all things Disney. This week we've been chatting about Disney IP and if the parks are overflown with IP over original rides. So go and check that out on Friday when it drops, and when it does, you'll know because I'll share it on the Instagram page. So we're going to start with mousekeeping. So the big news, parks wise, we've got a lot of park news, and then we've got the Golden Globes and Critics' Choice Awards nominations that we'll dive into. So Walt Disney announced the full calendar for 2026 currently. We have the Free Kids Dining Plan offering 2026 will be out soon. I'll mention about Frozen Ever After in a while with its closing date, but Frozen Ever After will reopen February 26th with the new audio animatronics updated with the new audio. Level 99 will be opening at Disney Springs Westside 2026. Epcot's International Festival of the Arts runs from January 16th to February 23rd. Then we get into spring, and I'll mention these two ones in a bit. But Big Thunder Mountain Railroad and Buzz Lightyear Space Ranger Spring are both scheduled to reopen after construction and the updates in spring 2026. The Disney After Hours will be beginning spring 2026, and the Epcot Flower and Garden Festival will be March 4th to June 1st, 2026. Coming into summer, we have the Cool Kids Summer, which includes the Bluey and Bingo at Conversation Station, which I mentioned when it broke last week before the podcast. The Magic of Disney Animation, it will be late summer 2026. The Rock and Roller Coaster starring the Muppets will be supposedly opening summer 2026. The Banana Ball will be May 29th to 30th at the ESPN Wild World of Sports. The Water Park Benefit will be summer 2026. Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Live Disney Junior will be summer 2026. And they've started casting for that soon. The Mandalorian and Grogu scene for Millennium Falcon Smuggler's Run will arrive summer 2026. I would assume it'll be around about May, because that's when the film comes out. We also have later in the year Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween Party, the Food and Wine Festival Fall 2026, and then obviously Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party, Disney Jollywood Nights, and Epcot's International Festival of the Holidays as Winter 2026. So that's how the calendar looks currently. I don't think there's anything else scheduled to open up, but I am quite surprised that Rock and Roller Coaster with Muppets is going to open that quick, because the Aerosmith's out, so maybe that's why it's only not going to take too long for it, because they've already got taken out the Aerosmith bit, as I mentioned last week on the podcast. So maybe that's why it's not going to take too long to get that up and running in terms of the ride, because it's just really recolouring the attraction and ride vehicle, and then adding the animatronic pre-show, which hopefully will work. So we'll run through Critics' Choice Awards first, then Golden Globes. As expected, Zootopia 2 and Elio were up for Best Animated Feature. Andor and Paradise are up for Best Drama. Diego Luna and Sterling K. Brown are up for Best Actor in a Drama for Andor and Paradise. Abbott Elementary, Only Murders in the Builder are up for Best Comedy Series. Chris Perfetti is up for Best Supporting Actor in a Comedy for Abbott Elementary. Jamil James is up for Best Supporting Actress in a Comedy for Abbott Elementary. Dying for Sex is up for Best Limited Series. Summer of '69 is up for Best Movie Made for Television. Michelle Williams is up for Best Actress in a Limited Series for Dying for Sex. Marvel Zombies, Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, and Bob's Burgers are all up for Best Animated Series. Jimmy Kimmel Live, interestingly, is up for Best Talk Show. And that is the main craft of the Critics' Choice. I'm sure there'll be production awards for casting or your production design. I'm sure fine, but for this, I couldn't only find like the main ones. So have a deep dive into it because that side's really interesting. And you don't actually get to see a lot of that televised, which is sad. So, Golden Globes. Zootopia 2, Ilio, both are for Best Animated Film. And we'll see how that runs for Oscars, because there's a lot of Golden Globes noms I'm curious about. And I'm intrigued. There's some surprises, there's some snubs I'm intrigued about. And because normally Golden Globes is a very big indicator for what the Oscars would look like. And what the shortlist for the Oscars could look like. So I'm very intrigued to see what could be up for Best Picture. There's some that I'm like intrigued that aren't there. And you've also got to remember when it comes to Golden Globes, when it comes to the Golden Globes, drama and comedy musicals separate. At the Oscars, it's just Best Picture, and they pick 10. So I think we should, and this is probably just my opinion, is we should really start splitting it into Best Drama and Best, because a lot of films don't get the praise because they're up against, and that's not to say that's a bad thing, because these are incredible films, and that, but you tend to find that comedies don't fare well at the Best Picture Oscar, because of how dramas are more perceived, and it is a real big pattern that I found, and I probably will do a deep dive on this at some point. So, cinematic and box office achievement, Avatar: Fire and Ash and Zootopia 2 are both up for best cinematic achievement. Avatar: Fire and Ash is up for best original song. Abbott Elementary, Only Murders in the Building are both up for best television series, musical or comedy. Best performance by a male actor in a television series, both Sterling K. Brown and Diego Luna are up for Paradise and Andor, respectively. Best performance in a female actor in television series, musical comedy, Aya Reedy for The Bear, and Selena Gomez for Only Murders in the Building. Best performance by a male in an actor in a television series, musical comedy, we have Steve Martin and Martin Shaw, both for Only Murders in the Building. So they are the main crux of the Golden Globe noms. Sure, there'll be a lot more. They tend not to showcase the craft stuff alongside these, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of noms, because it came out there was 27 noms across the Disney company for the Critics' Choice Awards, 29 noms across the Disney company for Golden Globes. So let's run through the headlines. You can go and deep dive these at alldisneyworldnewstoday.com or get the app, because that's where I find most menus when it comes to the parks. Not so much the films TV, but definitely what's coming in and out of parks in terms of merch and what's available online. So we have this is commencing from the 3rd of December till the 7th December. The Disney Jollywood Nights Loungefly bag is now discounted. If it comes on Shop Disney, you might get it, because it does look really nice. There are new Mickey Mini earrings and necklaces at the Disneyland Resort. Crews have been working on the walls throughout Disney's Grand Floridian Resort lobby. Zootopia is now past 600 million box office globally. That will have changed, and I'll be interested to see when I do the box office projections in the new year once we've seen what Zootopia's final earning will be when it's finished its theatrical run. And we'll find out what we're looking at there in the box office rundown of the year, because we've still got Zootopia 2 and Avatar Fire and Ash are still yet to project, so we'll see where the box office and how Disney's created that done fair this year, really, in terms of box office success. Especially, well, I'll give you a tease. I think it's been better in the second quarter of the year. The second half, third quarter of the year, in terms of film. So there is now new refillable Mickey Magic Key popcorn buckets coming to Disneyland Resort, and that includes the California Adventure 25th anniversary design. Food, merchandise, and more have been revealed for the Palooza debut of Minnie's Wonderland at Tokyo Disneyland Resort. Frozen Ever After closes January 26th, 2026 for the updates on the audio for the animatronics, reopening in February. Big Thunder Mountain's railroad has been testing again, and the construction was expanded, which is why I think Thunder will probably reopen before. It was like, Space Ranger Spin, just from what I've seen, there seems to be a lot more wheels moving for Thunder. The entrance has been reconstruction. The entrance reconstruction has been continued at the Disney's Polynesian Village Resort. More Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party merchandise is now available to Magic Kingdom Day guests. The Magic Kingdom trolley has not been running due to damaged Main Street pavement, so if you haven't seen the tram, that's why. More details have been announced for the Cool Kids Summer, as I mentioned beforehand. It's a really interesting thing to deep dive. There is a new Loungefly canvas backpack that now features Disney Park attraction icons that's now available. Interestingly, you'll be able to meet Rapunzel and Mulan at the new Disney Animation Studios, kind of where you do the drawing of the Disney characters in Hollywood Studios, and there'll be 6 across the Disney eras that are going to be meeting and greeting in there. So that'd be interesting to see who they put in there. There's going to be 6, and we've got 2 announced so far. There's a new Mickey and Friends Christmas artwork by Craig Fraser even, at Disneyland. Jennifer Goodwin and Ke Huy Quan have been promoting Zootopia and Road Indiana Jones Adventure as part of the marketing, which I find incredibly interesting they chose to road that one, considering that's going to be taking over Dinosaur when Dinosaur closes. Rest in peace, Dinosaur. But I do find it very interesting that they showed that ride off, knowing that we're all a bit about it going to Animal Kingdom and replacing such an iconic a ride for Dinosaur. So we're a bit like, it's an interesting one for them to choose. Especially since they've just put in the Zootopia bit in the Tree of Life, and they didn't choose that one. So I do think that was we're going to show you what's coming kind of thing. There's a Disney World Vintage logo tote now available in the parks. You can no longer order custom Disney phone cases in Disney Springs. The Explore key is to replace current Enchantment key at Disneyland. Lamplight Lounge at Disney California Adventure is closing for refurbishment, while the refurbishment on Beach Club Resort Port Coquet has been completed. Disney has shared Disneyland's return dates for Paint the Night Parade and the 70th anniversary entertainment. And we've also had the first look at new Disneyland 70th merch that now features Tinkerbell. The vertical structure is now visible for the Encanto ride in Animal Kingdom, which I'm intrigued yet also scared about what they're going to do with that. There's also more Avatar Fire and Ash merch available in the park. There is going to be a Minnie Mouse popcorn bucket coming to Tokyo Disney Resort soon. There's a lot of news, so I'm just trying to go through what is thing. So Star Wars: A New Hope will be restored and is coming to face for the 50th anniversary on the 19th of February 2027. The Simpsons movie has been pushed back to Labor Day weekend 2027 from its July release, and I probably would guess that so they can get the animation completed properly in time. There's a new talking Walt Disney figure released at Magic Kingdom. Extra Fantasmic performances have been added for the Saturday after Christmas, interestingly. Some sad news. Frank Gehry, who was an architect behind Walt Disney Concert Hall and more, has died at age 96. It's a bit of sad news. Avengers Endgame will be re-released in cinemas in September 2026, ahead of Doomsday release in December. Interestingly, there is a new redesigned Dumbo the Flying Elephant playset released at Walt Disney World. Disneyland and IKEA have teamed up for exclusive in-store pop-ups and activities. Sounds interesting. Hong Kong Disneyland have launched blind boxes for ride vehicle figures, including Mystic Manor. So there's some Hong Kong news amongst this. A Disney fan has rode Radiator Springs races for the 15,000th time, which makes that a record. Rivers of America's totem poles have been removed from Magic Kingdom, so you'll expect to see a lot of the Piston Peak, Bill and Thorn stuff starting to get constructed along there. Disney have been casting the host of Mickey Mouse Clubhouse show at Disney's Hollywood Studios. There is a glow-in-the-dark haunted mansion hat now available at Magic Kingdom. Benjamin Bratt has been revealed as the 2025 candlelit session and narrator at Disneyland. So yeah, there's a lot of news that I think if you want to have a bigger deep dive into what's been coming out in the last weekend, also what came out in the last few days, go download the Walt Disney World News Today app and have a deep dive for yourself and see what they do, how they really are everything. You can flip through a day and there's been that amount of news that you're like, oh wow, so much has happened. So I would suggest I'll link a link for Walt Disney World News Today in the bio of this podcast episode. And there, so that is the news. There's a lot. So, getting on to Fantasia. So Fantasia was directed by Samuel Armstrong, James Algar, Bill Roberts, Paul Satterfield, Ford Bebe, Norman Ferguson, David Hand, Jim Henley, T. Hay, Wilfred Jackson, Hamilton Lusk, and Ben Sharpstein. The film is produced by Walt Disney and Ben Sharpstein. Written by Joe Grant, Dick Huna, and stars Deems Teller, Leopold Stokowski. Music is by Various, as we'll deep dive later on. Cinematography is from James Wong Howe. Studios are Walt Disney Productions. It was distributed by Walt Disney Productions at its premiere, and RKO Radio Pictures world release. The film was released November 13th, 1940, making it the third film canonically in the Disney film series. The film's initial running time is 124 minutes. It was 81 minutes in its 1942 edit, 150 minutes in all versions 1946 to 1990 in its release, and was 120 minutes, on its 1991 VHS release. The film was released in English. It had a budget of 2,280,000, and that's just an estimate, so there doesn't really seem to be a thing. And its gross revenue was $83,320,000. So Fantasia is a 1940 American animated anthology film and was produced by Walt Disney Productions, as I've mentioned. The film consists, and this is where this week's podcast is going to be a little bit different to Snow White and Pinocchio, because there's so many subsections, it's easier to talk about each section in general in terms of going by story, by Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It's easy just to talk about each of the things when going over the general synopsis of each segment. And that's why. So the film consists of 8 animated segments, which are set to pieces of classical music conducted by Leopold Stokowski, 7 of which are performed by the Philadelphia Orchestra. Music critic and composer Deems Taylor acts as the film's master of ceremonies, who introduces each segment in the live-action interstitial scenes. So there's a little bit of this. This is what this is. We see the scene, so it's a really nice thing. Disney settled on the film's concept as work need completion on the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which was an elaborated silly symphony short designed as a comeback role for Mickey Mouse, who had declined popularity. So this is very interesting that this was his way of rebuilding Mickey Mouse now that he'd been creating these big animated feature films, Snow White and Pinocchio. The soundtrack was recorded using multiple audio channels and recorded with Fantasound, something I'll discuss in about, which was a pioneering sound reproduction system that made Fantasia the first commercial film shown in a stereophonic sound. Mickey was redesigned by Fred Muir into his current design, starting in the pointer. Here, though, he is dressed in a red sorcerer robe, and to complete the look, he dons his master's sorcerer's hat. The energy absorbs into his blood. Fantasia was first released in theatrical roadshows engagements held in 13 US cities from November 13th, 1940. It received mixed critical reaction and was unable to make a profit. In part, this was due to World War II. Which, as we go through these 1940 films, World War II is an impact on the reception, the box office, and that obviously cut off the profitable European market. But this was also due to the film's high production costs and the expense of leasing theatres and installing the Fantasound equipment. So these theatres didn't have the capacity for how the sound was created, and therefore, as of 2012, Fantasia's grossed $76.4 million in domestic revenue, and it's the 22nd highest grossing film of all time in the US when it's adjusted for inflation. Roy E. Disney, Walt's nephew, would co-produce a sequel release in 1999 titled Fantasia 2000. The film has gained a huge cult following since its first release and is notably important to the film industry as a milestone in the creation of the modern music video, which I find quite fascinating in terms of developing sound and how we've come a long way in creation sound. And I do think that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of releasing sound and developing it. So its production history. So, in 1938, Disney felt that the studio's star character, Mickey Mouse, he needed a boost in popularity as he declined, and therefore Fantasia was born. And I do think it's really interesting that this is how he decided to bring Mickey back to the forefront and give him his own film, which I find really interesting that we haven't really seen that capitalized upon, that Mickey's the mascot of Disney. And even so with the parks, I was surprised that it took so long for us to get a Mickey Mouse attraction in Mickey Minnie's Runaway Railway. From memory, I don't know, maybe there was another ride at some point. Do I think it should have overtook the Great Movie Ride and being Hollywood Studios? No. But I am glad that there is some representation for the mascot of Disney in the parks. So the Sorcerer's Apprentice was was a deluxe cartoon short based on the poem written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and was set to the orchestral piece by Paul Dukas. And this piece of music was also designed and based upon the original tale of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which really much derives from Arthurian legend and it set the baseline for creating what would become Sword in the Stone. I think, genuinely speaking, the Sorcerer's Apprentice really ties in to there. And what I find really interesting about this is that the concept was matching animated to classical pieces of music, which hadn't really been done since the short films and the silent films of the 1930s in terms of creating unique pieces of sound. And it just happened, which I find incredibly interesting, is that it happened to just meet Leopold Stokowski, who was the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra since 1912, at a restaurant in Hollywood. And it was just by chance, and therefore he discussed the plans for the short. And he was happy to collaborate on the project and offered to conduct the piece at no cost, which it just shows it's who you know and who you never know you're going to bump into that helps create your visions. It just so happened that he was in the right place at the right time and met this person who was more than happy to help and create a piece of wonderful film. So following the meeting, the New York representative ran into Stokowski on a train headed for the east. And in writing to Disney, he reported that he was really serious in his offer to do the music for nothing. In addition, he had some very interesting ideas on instrumental colouring, which would be perfect for an animation medium. And in his excited response, Disney would write that he felt all steamed up of the idea on Stokowski's working with us. The union of the pair and his music together with the best of our medium would be the means of a success and should lead to a new style of motion picture presentation, which I find incredibly interesting to dissect and divulge in terms of crafting narrative, because especially now, you can have these sequences where you don't need to say anything in a scene and let your music and soundscape can tell you what an audience needs to get without the dialogue. And I don't think we'd got there really in those early 1940 films in terms of highlighting that we don't need to tell everything. And I do think that this probably was a very good use of showcasing that in terms of sound scale, and thus created something special and unique. There's just something very avant-garde about this film, in that it's 8 small pieces that are stitched together to create this unique and visual and soundscape in terms of a Disney film, and allowing younger audiences to understand classical music and be introduced to these beautiful soundscapes that can help and tell the narrative without telling the narrative, in so to speak. And I find that really interesting and dynamic from a sound perspective, creating music. So an agreement was signed by Disney and Stokowski on December 16th, 1937. So not long after Snow White was just about to be released. So you can tell that all these ideas were already bubbling in his mind, in the background of what to do next after Snow White. And therefore allowed the conductor to select and employ a complete symphony orchestra for the recording. Disney hired a stage at the Culver Studios in California for the session, and it began at midnight on January 9th, 1938, and would last for 3 hours using 85 Hollywood musicians. And I just love how all these musicians brought what they knew and created just this beautiful soundscape that we'll get onto when I talk about the use of the sound in each of these short within the shots that are stitched together to create this beautiful narrative in terms of soundscape. What I find interestingly, it became clear to Disney and his brother Roy this was gonna cost, and that the studio's finances, because now the film had climbed to $125,000 already, and because of its very very experimental and unprecedented nature, we have no idea what can be expected from such a production. Ben Sharpstein, who was a production supervisor on the film, noted, and therefore its budget was 3 to 4 times greater than the usual silly symphony, which we've already found with Snow White and Pinocchio. These films started to cost a lot more because of the use of the narrative. What they wanted to tell was bigger than any silly symphony. And thus this was the birth of a new concept, a group of separate numbers, regardless of their running time, put together in a single presentation. And therefore it turned out to be a concert, something novel and of high quality, which I find vastly fascinating in terms of telling a narrative on screen and allowing this unique and fascinating soundscape to really allow a unique way of telling stories and allowing these stories to really set the tone and allow them to breathe in their own right. But it did cost. And I think that's what we found here in these earlier films. And I think we're seeing it now with Disney in terms of them picking and choosing what they release and how they release it. And I do think marketing is a massive factor, especially now we're in the post-COVID era where cinemas aren't at high demand as they used to be. You have to find a good way of marketing to get people to come see your film. Because at the end of the day, this is a business, and we want to be able to sell films. So ideas to produce such a complex and complete feature film was therefore pursued in 1938 February, and therefore inquiries were made to extend Stokowski's contract. In August of the same year, Disney would ask Stokowski's representative to have him return to the studios select material for the new film, which was initially titled The Concept Feature, which I find really interesting that we went from that working title to Fantasia. And I do think in terms haven't found this in thing, but from my thing, I think it is because it's such a fantasy. Each piece is its own fantasy, which allows it to become Fantasia. It's like a fantasy tale. I don't know if that's the inkling they went for, but that's my interpretation of what Fantasia means to me. Therefore, the pair further thought of presenting the film with an on-screen host to introduce each of the segments, which I think was a really smart move to be able to allow audiences to understand what was about to happen. And therefore, if you wanted to watch one on its own, you could, in terms of its soundscape. And therefore, they heard composer and music critic James Taylor provide an intermission commentary during radio broadcasts of the New York Philharmonic and agreed he would be the most suitable for the role. He contacted Taylor about the project, but they then work on Pinocchio, Bambi, and development on his new Burbank studio kept him too busy to work on the new feature, which I find so interesting once again that Bambi was really far on in early development for a long time. And as we discussed last week, they thought Bambi would be second, and I do find that really fascinating. That and when we get to Bambi, I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting production history to delve into. But I do find that so fascinating that that is where we were at this time in production and in terms of creating film, and that there was so much in this that made him not be able to focus directly. And I wonder maybe if they had focused one on one, we might not have the Disney we have today. So it's quite fascinating to deep dive into this. Taylor was asked during a call on September 3rd, 1938, and would leave to come to the studios as soon as possible. And 2 days later, he left New York for Los Angeles for a month's visit. So Taylor would arrive at the studio one day after a series of meetings began to select the musical pieces for the concert feature. Disney made storywriters Joe Grant and Dick Hummer gather a preliminary selection of music, and along with Stokowski, Taylor and the heads of various departments discussed their ideas. And each meeting was recorded verbatim by stenographers, with participants being given a copy of the entire conversation for review, which I find incredibly interesting, that this was the original table read, that this was the one of their original pitch meetings, and they would keep going back and make sure it was recorded in order to have these production meetings to go. It's just fascinating to see how production meetings have developed and come a long way from where they originally were. And where are we up to? And therefore, it is a really interesting thing to think about in terms of soundscape. However, he admitted that his knowledge of music was instinctive and untrained. In one meeting, which I find interesting here, he inquired about a piece of which he might build something of a prehistoric theme with animals. The group was considering The Firebird by Igor Stravinsky, but however, Taylor noted that his La Scudder Crintemps, I've butchered that, would be something on that order, to which Disney replied, upon hearing the recording, this is marvellous. It would be perfect for prehistoric animals. There would be something terrific in dinosaurs flying, lizards, and prehistoric monsters. There could be beauty in the settings, which I find incredibly interesting, because I just don't know about that. And something interesting just to dive into. And there's just so much here to really dive into in terms of production history. So numerous choices were discarded as talks would continue, including Moto Perpetuo by Niccolo Pagani, with shots of dynamos, cogs, pistons, and whirling wheels to show the production of a collar button. Other deletions include Prelude in G minor, and Throk by Sergei Rachmaninoff, and a rendition of the Song of the Flea by Mussorgsky, which was to be sung by Lawrence Tibbett. Which I find interesting, that this was a trial and error. We'll see what works, what doesn't work, and figure out what we should put in and what we won't put in. So in 1938, September 29th to be exact, around 60 of Disney's artists would gather for a 2.5-hour piano concert, while he provided a running commentary about the new musical feature. A rough version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is arguably the most famous sequence from this film, barring A Night on Bald Mountain, which I think has really become more iconic now, potentially because of Fantasia 2000, but I haven't watched that in a while, so once we get there, I'll see if that was the case. And according to one attendee, had the crowd applauding and cheering until their hands were red. The final pieces were chosen the following morning, which included Toccata and Fugue in D minor, Sidilis Ilechevit, Hyde by Gabrielle Pien, the Nutcracker Suite, Night on Bald Mountain, A Maria, Dance of the Hours, Claire de Lune by Claude Debussy, The Rite of Spring, and The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Disney had already begun working out the details for the segments and showed greater enthusiasm and eagerness as opposed to his skepticism while starting Pinocchio, which I find incredibly interesting that his head was probably here. He was like, if he'd seen Pinocchio and thought, I don't know if it's going to work, a lot of his energy, I think, was probably here. And he was far more fascinated in developing this project over Pinocchio, which is not a bad thing, but I do think probably he was far more invested and that this was his, once again, as much as Snow White was, this was his idea. And he really wanted this to succeed in terms of creating a story, especially after creating Mickey Mouse and all those characters, that he'd want this film to succeed to make sure its legacy was still around. And ultimately, you can understand why. And that Pinocchio, it just wasn't for him. And I think not every project was for Disney. So, Claire de Lune was soon removed from the Fantasia program, but Disney and his writers encountered problems setting a concrete story to Cylides. It's interesting to see that even though they decided them, they still run into problems and created real dilemmas when it comes to the things. So on January 5th, 1939, following a search for a stronger piece to fit the mythological theme, the piece was replaced by Beethoven's Sixth Symphony section. However, Stokowski disagreed with the switch, believing that Disney's idea of mythology is not quite what the symphony is about. He was also concerned about the reception from classical music enthusiasts who would criticize Disney for venturing too far from the composer's intent. On the other hand, Taylor welcomed the change, describing it as a stunning one and saw no possible objection to it. So it really shows that even the people creating it, they all disagreed on what should be in, what shouldn't be in, and that they all had opinions on what this film should really intelligently about. There's so much, but it's really, really interesting. So the new feature continued to be known as the concert feature, or musical feature, as late as November 1938. Helen Hahn, a publicist for Disney's film distributor, RKO Radio Pictures, wished for a different title and gave the suggestion Film Harmonic Concert. Stuart Buchanan then held a contest at the studio for a title that produced almost 1,800 suggestions. So this is where it actually came from. So I should have just really dig deep into this, because I have really had a chance to really read this section. So I'm finding this out here as well. And produced almost that amount of suggestions, including back to Stravinsky and Bach and Hybrowski by Stokowski. Still, the favourite among the film's supervisors was Fantasia, and which had been an early working title that had grown on home. It isn't the word alone, but the meaning we read into it. From the beginning of its development, Disney expressed the greater importance of music in Fantasia compared to his past work. And that's really interesting that this is where Fantasia comes from, that it was just an early working title that just sat on the sidelines and then just went, oh, this could work. In our ordinary stuff, our music is always under action. But on this, we're supposed to be picturing the music, not the music fitting our story, Disney explains, which I find is very much rooted in this film, that this music is the story. The music is showcasing and highlighting what you should be feeling, how you should be feeling from this film. And it's a really interesting quote there, that Disney hoped the film would bring classical music to people that including himself, had walked out on this. So, as I just said before, this is their way of going, we've got a Disney film, but you're going to really understand and learn about classical suites and how these classical suites of music can really interlope and interconnect and intertextualize each of the stories that we're about to tell you on screen. And I do find that incredibly interesting. So, animation of The Sorcerer's Apprentice began on January 21st, 1938, when James Algar, the director of the segment, assigned animator Preston Blair to work on the scene, where Mickey Mouse wakes from his dream. Each of the 700 members of staff at the time received a synopsis of the Golf tale and were encouraged to complete a 20-question form that requested their ideas on what action might take place. Layout artist Tom Kodrick created what Dick Hernick described as brilliantly coloured thumbnails from preliminary storyboard sketches using Gorak paints, which featured the bolder use of colour and lighting than any previous Disney short. Therefore, Mickey was redesigned by animator Fred Muir, who added pupils for the first time, which would create and achieve greater ranges of expression, which I find really interesting. That this is where that iconic classic Mickey Mouse that we're all familiar with really delves and derives from Fantasia rather than the original Mickey Mouse shorts, which I find fascinating. And most of the segment was shot in live action, including a scene where a UCLA athlete was asked to run and jump across one of the studio's sound stages with barrels in the way, which was used to reference when Mickey traverses through the water, which I find so fascinating that we're still using people where we're able to understand how a scene should be crafted and how we're going to do that by getting people to animate and create it. And I'd love to know if there was any actual footage of this still around that somebody has in the Disney Vault, because I do think it's really fascinating to understand how they created these filmscapes. And I think there is so much here in terms of crafting this film. And I do think, as much as there is me discussing and talking about it here, I do think it would be interesting for you to do a deep dive in for yourself, because there is so much in terms of the production history on this film that there's just so much here that I'm actually looking at now. So one of the things I will dive into here is the idea of sound. So in January 18th, 1939, so this is a year on now, Stokowski signed an 18-month contract with Disney to conduct the remaining pieces with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And recording would begin in April and last for 7 weeks at the Academy of Music, which was the orchestra's home. And this was where they created the missing sound, and there was 483,000 feet of film that was used to complete and create the film that we know and watch today, and that managed to cost almost $18,000. And once they had finished the recordings, they arrived at the studio, and a meeting was held on July 14th, 1939, to allow the artists to start working on each segment to listen to Stokowski's arrangements and suggest alterations to the sound to work. The Disney brothers would contact David Samoff of the RCA regarding the manufacture of a new system that would create the illusion that the actual symphony orchestra is playing in the theatres. He backed out of first due to the financial reasons, but later agreed in July 1939 to make the equipment, so long as the Disneys would hold down the estimated $200,000 in costs. Though it was not exactly known how to achieve their goal, engineers at Disney and RCA investigated many ideas and tests to do so. Fantasound employed 2 projectors running at the same time, with one containing the picture film with a mono soundtrack for backup purposes. The other ran a sound film that was mixed from the 8 tracks recorded at the Academy to 3 of which contained the audio for the left center, and bright stage. And creating sound and delving into it is an incredibly interesting and unique thing to do. And having recorded sound myself for the last few years at uni, it is a very delicate and interesting thing in being able to work out what channels you need. Is it in mono? Is it in sync? Making sure that it's in sync with camera audio as well, which is really interesting, and it's frustrating at times when you don't get it right. And it can be frustrating in working out how to get it to the right settings, what you need to do. So I understand that this was probably a very difficult and fascinating process. So the illusion of sound travelling across the speakers was achieved with a device named Panpot, which I find incredibly hilarious, and was directed the predominant movement of each audio channel with the control track, and therefore mixing the soundtrack required 6 people to operate the various panpots in real time. So there was already a lot of people and a lot of work went into getting this film to what it is today, and what we can rewatch again and again on Disney Plus. Disney ordered 8 3-color oscillators from the newly established Hewitt-Packard Company to monitor the recording levels and lower frequencies, predecessor from VU meters used today. Between the individual takes, prints, and remakes, approximately 3 million feet of sound film was used in the production of Fantasia. Almost a fifth of the film's budget was spent on its recording techniques, which I find so fascinating and unique to think about. That's how we really developed this idea of soundscape with this film. The ideas and revolutionary ideas of how to record sound, the way that sound is used to craft film and dissect in unique ways of filmmaking is such a fascinating and unique thing. And that's why this film really stands the test of time, because there is so much depth and ideology behind the film that really revolutionized the way that cinema really dives into sound and how we dissect and look at sound as a whole today. And I do find that incredibly fascinating to deep dive and interlock into what was sound, how was sound created this film, because this film costs a lot, and I do think that it really created this idea of having classical soundscapes and a score within a film, and how you tell a film without expositional dialogue, that you can tell from a certain motif and allow audiences to understand what you should be getting from the scene, because you can feel it. You can tell by a certain soundscape. You can tell if it's a more happier sound or a more darker sound, and you're able to understand what is about to happen on the scene because you can tell by that motif. And I do find that incredibly fascinating to delve into from a sound perspective in terms of creating unique soundscapes. And I do find that really beautiful and interesting to think about. So we're almost an hour in, and we're now at the program description. So we're about to dissect into each of the film's segments, the 8 segments. So for the film, the host and narrator of the film, Deems Taylor, introduces each piece in the program and gives a background on the composer's original intent. Of course, there was no intent to deceive anyone into thinking that Disney's interpretation was the original intent, but I do like that it's kind of copyright. It's kind of them going, this is what we originally intended, but we are not stealing this film. It's like, it does feel like a copyright thing going, we're going to just discuss and tell about what the original soundscape was. And I do find it incredibly fascinating that it's like education, this film, and educating youngsters. And I do think we should really delve more into this from a film point of view. And I do find it's incredibly unique in allowing classical scores to return. And I kind of wish that I'd discussed this a bit in one of my earlier contextual studies essays at uni that I didn't actually think about when discussing sound and how sounds come through because of this film. So I'm a bit like, I wish I had now. So some of the selections were shortened from their full length for the sake of the film's running time. Of the eight, of the 8 pieces, 4 are presented virtually complete. These being Toccata and Fugue, Sorcerer's Apprentice, The Dance of the Hours, which is actually expanded upon, and the Ave Maria. The Nutcracker Suite is a shorn of its miniature overture and march. The 25-minute Rite of the Spring, the longest segment in the film, is 10 minutes shorter than the original 35-minute work, and the Pastoral Symphony segment is performed in a 20-minute version rather than Beethoven's complete 40-minute original. There are also small internal omissions in Night on Bald Mountain. Fantasia was produced on a budget of 2,280,000, to which 400 million, nearly a fifth of its budget, went to the musical recording techniques, as mentioned before. Right, here we go. So Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Its musical score is Johann Sebastian Bach, Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Directed by Samuel Armstrong. Its story development is by Lee Blair, Elmer Plummer, and Phil Dyke. Art director is Robert Cormack. Background painting is by Joe Stahy, John Hench, and Nino Carb. Yeah. Visual development from Oscar Fischinger. Animation by Cy Young, Art Palmer, Daniel McManus, George Rowley, Edwin Ardall, Joshua Mido, and Comet Wood. So, without opening credits or any sort, curtains open to reveal an orchestral strand. Musicians are seen and ascending the stand, taking their seats, and turning the instruments on. Master of the ceremonies deemed televised and delivers an introduction to the film, and we see conductor Leopold Stokowski appear and begins conducting the first strains of his own orchestral with the toccata and fugue in D minor. So you get to see them beginning the film. You get to see them able showcasing what we're about to watch, and I find that incredibly fascinating. So the first third of the toccata and fugue is in live action and features an orchestra playing the piece, illuminated by abstract light patterns set in time to the music. And I find that really fascinating in that they allow this kind of lightscape to really delve into each of these types of storytelling and allow for this unique perspective to create such a fascinating and unique stylistic that each segment really has its and stand on its own in terms of how it's created and how it's done. And it's backed by stylized and superimposed shadows, which I find incredibly interesting because creating shadows is a very unique and delicate process. So it's really interesting that they were challenging themselves with this film and creating this almost avant-garde style piece that creates this unique. I say unique a lot in terms of the Fantasound. The number segs into an abstract animation piece, which was first for the Disney studio, and it's set in time to the music. Toccata and Fugue was inspired primarily by the work of the German abstract animator Oskar Finchenger, who had actually worked for a brief time on this segment. The animation segues back into the live-action footage of Stokowski as the piece concludes, setting the precede for the rest of musical numbers. So it's very much a prelude in terms of what we're going to do with this film. We're going to highlight and showcase this unique classical score created beautifully by these very respected composers, and in turn we're going to highlight and showcase different unique pieces. And I do find that this beautiful melody is very much allowing you to get ready, you settle in with this piece in terms of doing it. So although the Philadelphia Orchestra recorded the music for the film, except in Sorcerer's Apprentice, they do not appear on screen, however. The orchestra used on screen in the film is made up of the local Los Angeles musicians and Disney studio employees like Jimmy McDonald and Paul Smith, who mime to the pre-recorded tracks by Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. Originally, they were stated to be filmed in the introduction and into still segments, but the union and budgetary because of the budget and how they were unable to get that. And I think now, if this film was created and done in that way, they would 100% have been the orchestra in the film. And I don't think we would have mimed to it either. So you can already see that this was one of the things they had to bring back because they didn't have the budget for this. And that is a sad thing, but in all honesty, you can't really tell that they're miming if you don't know that they're miming, and that's a really interesting thing. And I do like this melody. So let's move on. The Nutcracker Suite. Its musical score is Peter Tchaikovsky. I've just butchered that. The Nutcracker Suite Op 71A. It is directed by Samuel Armstrong. Story development was Sylvia Holland, Norman Wright, Albert Heath, Bianca Malloya, and Graham Haid. Names I've mentioned, I think, a lot. Definitely some of them in last week's podcast with Pinocchio. Character designs by John Walbridge, Elmer Plummer, and Ethel Pulsar. Art direction by Robert Cormack, Alzinen, Curtis D. Perkins, Arthur Byron, and Bruce Bushman. Background painter John Hanch, Ethel Coulter, and Nino Cart. Animation by Art Babin, Les Clark, Don Lusk, Cy Young, and Robert Stokes. Choreography was by Jules Engel. So, the Nutcracker Suite is a selection of pieces from Tchaikovsky's classical ballet. It's a personified depiction of the changing of the seasons, first from the summer to the autumn and then from autumn to winter. However, unlike the ballet, this version has no plot and it features a variety of dances just as in the original, but danced by animated fairies, fish, flowers, mushrooms, and leaves. And there's no actual nutcracker is ever seen in this version, which I find incredibly interesting that it's the Nutcracker, but there's no Nutcracker, which is quite ironic and funny. But I do like the idea that we're highlighting the seasons, and this is kind of like we're going to teach young audiences about how seasons change. So I quite like that, and I think the idea is more from the musical score, is that you get this idea of things are changing in each sequence that I find fascinating to delve within. Many elements are rendered carefully and painstakingly using techniques such as dry brush and airbrush, and the musical segments are as follow. So as dawn breaks over a meadow during the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, tiny fairies sprinkle drops of dew on every flower and stern. That is followed by a cluster of tiny mushrooms dressed in long robes and cool hats resembling Chinese, plus one little mushroom always out of step, performing the Chinese dance, which is probably more of an idea of the Chinese New Year and where that sits. Multicoloured blossoms shaped like ballerinas perform the dance of the flutes. A school of underwater goldfish performs a graceful Arab dance. High-kicking thistles dressed like Cossacks, and orchids dressed like lovely Russian peasant girls, join together for the wild Russian dance. In the final musical segment, Waltz of the Flowers, autumn fairies colour everything they touch brown and gold with their wands. Then the frost fairies arrive and everything becomes part of an icy dew-like pattern among fallen snowflakes. Which therefore showcases this idea of the narrative being this long, and its idea of showcasing the different seasons passing by, which I find really interesting and dynamic to think about in terms of creating unique storytelling, and it really just allows audiences to understand that this is the idea of them teaching the audiences about the seasons. And I really like its motif, and it's like a kind of whimsical piece compared to the previous one, and that we get this idea of a storytelling without sound. But I do find it ironic that there's no nutcracker. So, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, arguably the most famous and more recognizable musical suite, and what audiences instantly think about when they think about this film. So, Sorcerer's Apprentice was directed by James Alger. Story development, Tess Pierce and Carl Thalberg. Art direction by Tom Kodrick, Charles Phillip, and Zach Squatts. Background painting, Claude Coates, Stan Small, Albert Dempster, and Eric Hansen. Animation supervisors, Fred Muir and Vladimir Bill Titler. Animation by Les Clark, Riley Thompson, Marvin Woodward, Preston Blair, Edward Love, Hugo de Orsi, George Rowley, and Cormet Wood. So The Sorcerer's Apprentice is perhaps the best known Mickey Mouse short, as I've said that, especially after his debut in Steamboat Willie. And it's the story of Sorcerer Jens Sid's ambitious but lazy assistant who attempts to work some of the magical feats of his master before he knows how to properly control them. Mickey plays the role of the apprentice in the segment and becomes one of the most famous segments in the movie, as I've just mentioned. And I find it very ironic and hilarious that Sorcerer's Jens Sid, and if you spell that backward, it's Disney, which is quite hilarious. After the music ends, Mickey and the conductor Leopold Stowski, seen in silhouette, congratulate each other with a live-action animation handshake. In the original roadshow version, after Mickey leaves, James Taylor and the musicians applaud Mickey and Stowski, which I find really interesting that seems to be the most shortest, yet it's the most famous, probably because of Mickey, in terms of its storytelling, and that's why this week's episode is called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And I do find it really interesting that this is where it is the iconic ideology of the broomsticks walking, and it's such an interesting and fascinating thing to think about in terms of storytelling and unique perspective. Moving on, we have The Rite of the Spring, which is musical score by Igor Stravinsky, which is The Rite of the Spring, directed by Bill Roberts and Paul Satterfield. Story development, research, William Martin, Leo Thiel, Robert Sturmer, and John Fraser McLeish. Art director, Nick Lawrence Stewart, Dick Kelsey, and John Hubley. Background painting, Ed Starr, Bryce Mark, and Edward Levitt. Animated supervisor, Wolfgang Reifman and Joshua Medor. Animation by Philip Duncan, John McManus, Paul Busk. Art Palmer, Don Tauber, Edwin Ardall, Paul B. Kossoff, and John Sibley. And special camera effects by Gil Papineau and Leonard Pickley. So the interpretation of The Rite of the Spring features condensed versions of the history of the Earth, from the formation of the planet to the first living creature, to the age, reign, and extinction of the dinosaurs, which I find so fascinating and interesting that we'd later discuss this in Pixar's The Good Dinosaur, and the Ice Age films that Disney now owns after buying 20th Century Fox. It's a really interesting thing to think about. And we get this realistic animated prehistoric creatures, which include the Tyrannosaurus Rex, Dimetrodon. I'm not gonna attempt to even. We have to really pronounce them because it's hard to pronounce. We have the Stegosaurus is a villainous Tyrannosaurus Rex according to the preliminary introduction. And therefore we get this idea of showcasing how the world became to be, and it really highlights and showcases to younger audiences of teaching things. And I find that fascinating that as a whole, this real piece is discussing and highlighting how audiences feel in terms of creating this ideology, in terms of highlighting how the world. Roadshow version of the film features a humorous moment omitted from the general release version when Deems Taylor announces the title of the work. There is a sudden loud crash in the percussion section, and we see that the chimes player has accidentally fallen against his instrument. He sheepishly gets up to the amused chuckling of Taylor. I wonder why that was omitted, because I think as much it showcases that these people are there, and that there is definitely someone there. There is the intermission soundtrack directed by Ben Sharpstein and David Hohan, and it just really the intermission between the films and Deems Taylor announces the 15-minute intermission. There's not really too much for this section, so we move on to the Pastoral Symphony, which is musical score by Ludwig van Beethoven, which is Symphony number 6 in F Op 68 Pastoral. Directed by Hamilton Lusk, Jim Hanley, and Ford Bibby. Story development Otto Englander, Webb Smith, Erdman Penner, Joseph Sabor, Bill Peet, and George Stallings. Character designs by James Budder, John P. Miller, Lorma S. Sudstrom. Art direction Hugh Henney, Kenneth Anderson, J. Gordon Legg, Herbert Ryman, Neil Gracie, and Lance Nolle. Background painting by Claude Coates, Ray Huffman, W. Richard Anthony, Arthur Riley, Gerald Nives, and Roy Falcon. Animation supervisor Fred Muir, Ward Cumber, Eric Larson, Art Bobbitt, Ollie Johnston, and Don Towsey. Animation Bernie Wolf, Jack Campbell, Jack Bradbury, James Milt Neal, Bill Justice, John Elliott, Walt Kelly, Don Lusk, Lynn Carp, Murray, McClure, Robert D.W. Youngquish, and Harry Harnster. Whew. There's a lot of people that worked on this one. So the Pastoral Symphony utilizes delicate colour styling to depict a mythical ancient Greek world of centaurs, families of so this is the original Greek mythology and ideology of showcasing what was going on with the Greeks. And I'm a very big ancient Greek nerd when it comes to it. So when we get to Hercules, I might bring out a lot of the nerdity in that ideology, the mythology. It's just so fascinating to understand and delve into it because there's so much lore to delve into. And Disney originally intended to use Sildis by Gabriel Pierre as the musical for the mythology section of the program. However, due to problems fitting the story to the music, the decision was made to abandon Sildis for other music. And it would be interesting to see how and what that would originally have looked like in terms of musical score. And this portion of the film was criticised for brief yet blatant nudity of the female centaurs. Not gonna lie, I didn't notice that, and to be fair, I don't really think you'd notice if you weren't looking for it. But if you were looking for it, you probably would. However, that I don't really need to look at that. And I do think it's a nice thing, but it's not one of the best sequences. I wouldn't say that with that. We're almost there with the sequences. Right. Dance of the Hours. Musical score Amilk Poncelli, La Gimonta Dance of the Hours, and is directed by T. He and Norm Ferguson. Character designs Martin Prowsey, James Bodder, Duke Russell, Earl Hurd. Art direction by Kendall O'Connor, Harold Dougherty, and Ernest Nordy. Background painting Al Dempster and Charles Connor. Animation supervision by Norm Ferguson. Animation by John Lounsbury, Howard Swift, Preston Blair, Hugh Fraser, Harvey Toms, Norman Tate, Hicks Lauke, Art Elliott, Grant Simmons, Ray Peterson, and Franklin Gudick. The dancers of the morning are represented by Madame Umpanova and her ostrich students, and the dancers of the afternoon are represented by Hyacinth Hippo and her hippo servants. Which is really interesting because this idea of the hyphenins and stuff is very much developed throughout Marvel Comics, and so it'd be interesting to see how much that is. And I very much like that ideology and that terms of what we're going to delve into in terms of creating such a unique thing. There's not too much to really talk about when it comes to this sequence, so if you want to have a more of a deep dive into this, go ahead, because I find it really fascinating to delve into. Right, Night of Bald Mountain, Ave Maria, the final one. The musical score is Modest Mowski's Now is the Bald Mountain, Franz Sugert's Ave Maria. Right, there's a lot. Directed by Wilfred Jackson, story development Campbell Grant, Arthur Heinen, and Phil Dyke. Art direction Kay Nelson, Terrell Stapp, Charles Prezant, and Thor Putnam. Its background painting by Marie Cox, Ray Lockram, Robert Storms, and W. Richard Anthony. Special English lyrics for Ave Maria by Rachel Field. Floral director Charles Henderson. Chorus Westminster Choir of Westminster Choir College. Operatic solo Juliet Novice. Animation supervisor by Bill Tyler. Animation John McManus, William N. Shute, Robert W. Carlson Jr., Lester Novus, and Don Patterson. Special animation effects Joshua Meadow, Miles E. Pike, John F. Reed, and Daniel McManus. Special camera effects by Gail Papier and Lord Leonard Piccoli. Whew. So the Night of Bald Mountain segment is a showcase for animator Bill Hatter, who gave the demon Chernabog a power and intensity rarely seen in Disney films. The devil known as Chernabog summons from the graves, empowering restless souls, and the horror of the demons ghosts, skeletons, vultures, ravens, fire women, witches, and harpies. So there's a lot of darker, more unique, fascinating storytelling written in here, and this really dark. And to the Sorcerer's Apprentice, this is the very much more iconic sequence in terms of highlighting these really unique on the idea. And I think that we really get to see this ideology of darker and unique things being explored. And it's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of that all these ideologies were brought together, and each of these were then, therefore, in turn, created this unique avant-garde style. And then overall, I quite enjoy Fantasia. It's not one that I'm going to jump to in terms of watching like again and again, but I do think it's got this charm that I think people do neglect to think about in terms of being able to talk about it. And it just really revolutionized the idea of sound and how to use sound within film. And therefore, it's a really interesting and unique thing to think about. So, Fantasia is featured in 3 lists that rank the greatest American films as determined by the American Film Institute. The film ranks number 58 in 100 movies in 1998, before it was dropped from its 10th anniversary revision in 2007, though it was nominated for inclusion. The 10 top 10 list formed in 2008, first Fantasia, 5th under animation. There's been some controversies. In the late 1960s, 4 shots from the Pastoral Symphony removed that depict 2 characters in a racially stereotyped manner. A black centaurette called Sunflower was depicted polishing the hooves of a white centaur, so you can understand why we would be removing that sequence. In May 1992, the Philadelphia Orchestra Association filed a lawsuit against the Walt Disney Company and Buena Vista Home Video, as a co-creation of Fantasia Orchestra, maintained that the group was entitled to half of the estimated $120 million profits from video, which you can very much understand. So it's not had its controversies in terms of production side, but I do find it really interesting to delve deep into it. So, Disney parks. It's interesting. So, the Sorcerer's Hat was once the icon of Disney's Hollywood studios, and I remember it. This is one of the things I can actually say I have seen when I went in 2014, which is almost a decade ago now. I remember the hat being there, and that was what I recognised at park as. However, I do agree that Hollywood Tower of Terror should really be the icon. I'm kind of glad that that is now the icon because it just fits more with Hollywood studios than I think the hat does of being the icon for the park. And you can meet Mickey as the you can meet Mickey as in Sorcerer Apprentice many times, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. Still, still located at the resort is Fantasia Gardens, which is a miniature golf course that integrates characters and objects from the film in each hole, which I find quite unique, and that's really interesting to think about, and really allows it's because Fantasia didn't really need a land, which I find interesting that when I get to this in a second that I found out by doing this research with Disneyland Australia, which I did not know was a thing till I started researching this. There is Disneyland is making their way to Disneyland as the Pinnacle World diorama along the Disney Railroad, which would be replicated for Tokyo Disneyland's Western River Railroad and Epcot's former Universe of Energy attraction. So it's very much rooted within the Disney parks and landscape. For the 20th anniversary of the Disneyland Paris, Mickey was depicted in a special version of his Sorcerer's Apprentice outfit. His friends donned similar outfits as well, which is kind of cool. One of the things that I found out, so in Disneyland Australia, which I never knew was a thing till I started doing this deep dive trying to find where Fantasia lived within the parks in creating this unique landscape. So there is a Fantasia Gardens is the park's central hub area, and it's obviously the land is based on the 1940 film, and it features attractions and entertainment inspired by the iconic scenes and characters from the movie, such as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. In addition to the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Fantasia Gardens also offers a variety of attractions and entertainment options inspired by different segments of the film. The park's icon, the Enchanted Fantasy Castle, can be found here. So there's two rides that I found some rides here. There is the Bald Mountain Sorcerer's Apprentice, which is new. There's the Enchanted Fantasy Castle walkthrough, Fantasy in the Sky, Pastoral Symphony, Fantasia Garden Theatre, Dance of the Hours. There's the Maestro Mickey's Pizzeria, and the Nutcracker Lounge for restaurants and refreshments. And for shops, there is the Crystal Clear Creations and Sorcerer Supply Co. So I find it so interesting that Disneyland Australia has this entire segment dedicated to Fantasia, whereas the other parks are like, a little bit. As part of the redevelopment of the Disney Animation Studio in Hollywood Studios, the hat is returning to Hollywood Studios as you walk into the new redesign and refurbishment of that area of the park, which I think is kind of cool and neat. That it's coming back and it will be a part of it. It's not going to be the park icon, but it will be there, and I'm quite happy about that. So let's talk about video games, the segment everyone loves. So in 1991, a side-scrolling eponymous video game was developed by Infragmo Games and was released for the Sega Mega Drive Genesis system, and the player controls Mickey Mouse, who must find missing musical notes scattered across 4 elemental words based upon the film's sequences. There are several film reel levels based on some of the movie segments, such as Sorcerer's Apprentice and Night on Bald Mountain, that appear in the Epic Mickey games. Jens Sid and Chernobog also make cameo appearance in the games. Jens Sid narrates the openings and endings of the 2 games, and served as the creator of Wasteland. Chernobog appears as a painting in the first game and appears in the Night and Bald Mountain film reel levels in the second, which I find really interesting. But I think this really became more iconic in now, and I really would hope that Chernobog gets some love in the Villains Land, which I find really amazing that we're going to get. Disney Square Enix crossover game series Kingdom Hearts features Chernobog as a boss in the first installment. the Night of Bald Mountain. It's the annual weekly Kingdom Hearts segment. Peace is played during the fight. Yensid appears frequently in the series, beginning with Kingdom Hearts 2, voiced in English by Corey Burton. Symphony of Sorcery, a world based on the movie, appears in Kingdom Hearts 3D. Dream Drop Distance, like the Timeless River world in Kingdom Hearts 2, it is featured as a period in Mickey Mouse's past. Sorcerer Mickey was a playable character in Disney Infinity. The first time I've been able to discuss Disney Infinity in terms of playable figure characters, and was also available as a crystal Mickey Mouse figure for the 2.0 edition. And there was many power discs created for him. And that really wraps up this week's podcast in terms of developing sound. And I do think it's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of crafting sound, a unique soundscape. And I do think it's a really unique thing to think about in terms of crafting a unique and visual soundscape in terms of dynamic storytelling. And that Fantasia is this, we don't really talk about it as much. And I think we really should do in terms of unique soundscapes and fascinating things in terms of unique storytelling vibes. And that it allows for this really fascinating and deep dive into this unique ideology. And it very much set the scale for what Disney would do with sound later on. So this week's shout outs go to my very good friend Dean Jason Coles, who is Dean's Barks and Vibes on Instagram. Lovely person. And you can catch me chatting to him on the Disney Hot Topic channel when it drops later on this week. I'd also like to shout out a beautiful little creation and company called Bridal Engravings, who are lovely people. And I have their coasters as they were at the Once Upon a Meetup that I went to in Leeds in October, and they're fabulous people. And their link there, it's bridal_engraving on Instagram, and I'll leave a link for their website to go and have a look at some fascinating things. I also want to quickly shout out my friends, the Wandering Wilkinsons, who are lovely people, and go and check out their vlogs. They're currently doing daily vlogs for Vlogmas, so go and check them out. And I think I'm going to wrap up this week episode by reminding you can follow me on Instagram at Straight Until Disney Pod, and you can find me there. Don't be afraid to DM, send me what your thoughts, if you have any opinions, and what you might want to see with this podcast, and how we can develop and grow. And I just want to say thank you for listening, and bye.